this book by Charles Roth, titled A New Way of Thinking. Charles Roth was one of our Unity ministers. He was ordained in 1953, and for the most of his ministry, he was the minister in the church Unity of Indianapolis. He was there for 30 years. He also ministered in Detroit and in Pasadena, California. During the time that he was doing his ministry, he wrote many articles for the Unity magazine and for Daily Word. He wrote 2 books during that period of time, A New Way of Thinking and Mind, the Master Power. Charles Roth was known in his ministry for his work with the mind, the law of mind action, as he stated it then. We may know it today. A more common phrase that we use is the law of attraction. Whatever we hold in our mind is what we tend to manifest out in the world. And the key here is hold in our minds, because every thought that flips through our mind doesn't come true. We know that, thank you God. One of my classmates, one day whenever we were discussing that, at what point do we get to have a thought held in mind, or one that's just flipping through your mind? Where's the cutoff point? I love the discussions that we used to have in seminary, because we were able to get really deep into some things. And one of my classmates, Bruce, said, case in point, he was very glad that everything that flips through our mind doesn't come true out in the world, because he lived in Seattle and he used to drive many times behind logging trucks, and a thought would occur to him: what if these restraints break and the logs all come barreling off of it? He said he was very happy that every thought that flipped through our mind wasn't one that came true. As a person thinks, so is that person. That's a very famous proverb. As we think, so are we. Books have been written with that title. As a man thinketh, so is he, is the King James version of it. Case in point, here's an example, a concrete scientific example. Dr. Ellen Langer was the first woman to be fully tenured in psychology at Harvard School of Medicine. Well, she decided to do this scientific experiment, and she collected up people that were either in their 70s or 80s, and she created an atmosphere, a town, basically, if you will, because these people lived there for a month. She created a town that was the 50s. And people were instructed, they were given clothes like they wore in the 50s, and they had magazines, TV shows, that type of thing. Newspapers were all from the 50s. They went to great pains to create this little village where they lived the 50s. And they were instructed to talk as if they were whatever age they were in the 50s, not remember when or anything like that. They talked about Elvis and the big bands and whatever, the president of the day and types of things like that. Well, prior to sending them to this village that had been created, measurements were taken: blood pressure, cognitive skills, even finger length. Now that, I understand that our fingers continue to grow as we get older. So they measured finger length. And so then they went to this village and they stayed for a month with each other and talking about these things. And something that happened that was not particularly scientific was that right down to the very last one, she reported that they looked younger. They moved quicker, their faces got softer, and that type of thing. But then whenever, at the end of this, they took all of these markers again, blood pressure, cognitive skills, reaction time, and finger length, and their fingers had become slightly shorter. Isn't that amazing? This is an example, a scientific example of what our mind can do. What our mind can do. So, right now, everybody pretend it's the 50s. We're going to play. You weren't born yet? Well, sorry, you can't listen. Charles Roth, one of the things that he was very famous for, he was famous for some of the things that he said really often. His most famous affirmation is, "The Spirit of the Lord goes before me, making easy, joyful, and successful my way." The Spirit of the Lord goes before me, making easy, joyful, and successful my way. Isn't that great? I love that. Some of the other things that he was rather famous for: prayer is not a substitute for action. It's a partner. We know that there is a scripture that says, faith without works is dead. So he expounded on this, putting feet to your faith, moving, doing what is yours to do in the world. Here's another one that he would say often. Worry syndrome produces doubt, then procrastination, and ultimately inertia. Now, part of knowing what we want in the world is knowing what we don't want. So that last one was a typical example of what we don't want. Stop arguing for your limitations. You get what you expect. Sometimes we, and we all do this, you know, I think we all do it. We look at what we see as so-called facts. Sometimes we just accept these things. We don't look at something or hear something and say, I accept that as a fact. There are some things we just accept and we don't question. We don't question. At the end of this talk, I'm going to give you a quotation that is the opposite of that. Looking at what we see as so-called facts and simply accepting it as the way that it is. There's a two-word, in one of the translations, this scripture is only two words. Two words. Test everything. Test everything. Don't take anything at face value. Don't take anything for granted. What you based your faith on yesterday may not work for today because you grow and you change. Outer circumstances are not the cause. That was one of the things that he used to say. Outer circumstances are not the cause. The exact same thing can happen to two or more people, and there are many reactions. Case in point, just an example. A basketball coach calls two players aside and says, the two of you really did poorly. It was because of you that we lost the game. What in the world were you thinking? And one could walk away and say, why did I even go out for basketball anyway? He has no right to criticize me. I quit. And the other one could walk away and say, you know, Coach was right. I really didn't give it my best. I really think what I will do is I'll come early to practice and stay late if I can, and I will improve my game. It can be the same situation. Our thinking is what decides how we will take it. And sometimes it can happen in the same person. As I was writing this, it occurred to me about a situation when I was in 4th grade. Have you ever had a teacher that you just couldn't please or, okay.
Lots of.
I felt like, and this, maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't, you know, it was my perception, and that's all I really have, is that Mrs. Sheffield was just out to get me in 4th grade. It's like, okay. Fortunately, I had Mrs. Douglas in 5th grade, and she was wonderful and compassionate, and she really, if I look back, I had 2 favorite teachers, Mrs. Douglas in 5th grade, and my English teacher in high school, Mrs. Jones. But back to Mrs. Sheffield. For a long time after I got out of school, and a long time after that, you know, I just thought she was the enemy. You know, how could she treat me this way? How could she, you know, on and on. You know how we make these things up in our mind. I didn't dare tell my parents what was going on because back then, at least in our family, teachers sat at the right hand of God. If I had said Mrs. Sheffield doesn't like me, my mom said, well, what did you do wrong? So, for years, I thought Mrs. Sheffield was the enemy. So see, for years, I was looking at it that way. And one day, I can't really remember the situation, but what I do remember is that I thought to myself, I had accomplished something. Can't remember what it was. And just through my mind immediately came this thought, I wonder what Mrs. Sheffield would think of me now. And so after that, I would sometimes think, you know, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this, you know, I overextended myself, whatever, and then I would think to myself, if Mrs. Sheffield was sitting in front of me, what would I do? Well, that would energize me. So even in the same situation, the same person, sometimes we see a situation a certain way, and we grow to learn that it can be something different from that. I still see her face sometimes, and I use that to spur myself on. Shakespeare said, he wrote, the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in the stars, but in ourselves. I really like that quotation because it, in a few words, says volumes to me, and in a poetic way. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with right judgment, Jesus said. So we hear that, and what is right judgment? What is right judgment? To me, what right judgment is, or at least one of the definitions could be, at least it is for me, is judge things according to possibilities and not, and I don't do this 100%, but look at things according to possibilities and not the so-called facts. I may look at the fact of the situation and it may look one way, but if I just release the so-called facts and pull up possibilities, many times I think of ways of approaching a certain thing that I haven't done before. There's a quote and I meant to bring my Course in Miracles book with me. I can't remember it verbatim, but this past week in Course in Miracles class, there were 2 sentences that basically said, no matter how it looks, I will never lose my right and ability to choose. That really jumped out at me. It really jumped out at me, probably mainly because there was a period of time in my life when I didn't know that I had the right to choose in every situation. If it's only the right to choose how I'm going to handle it or how I'm going to think about it in my own mind. We never lose our ability to choose. We may feel like there aren't any choices. We may not like the array of choices that we have, but we always, always, always have a choice. At least if we can't change circumstances, we can change the way we think about the circumstances. One of the things about changing our way of thinking many times will mean not buying into collective consciousness, not looking at what we call facts. That just because something is accepted by the masses does not mean that we have to accept it for our own life. And sometimes when that happens, we may feel ostracized from our friends, our family, those people that believe in a certain way. We may feel like we are not accepted. We may feel like we need to not to rock the boat. But all in all, at the end, many times, here's a way that I gauge things, and I've done this for many years. Especially if I'm looking at something, what I consider to be really, really important, I think to myself, I'm pretending this is the last day of my life. Would I be upset that I didn't do whatever it was? Or, excuse me. On the last day of my life, would I be bothered by not doing whatever is in front of me? Or would it be okay just to pass it by? This is a way that I gauge how important is this really to me. When I started going to a Unity church, excuse me, I got pushback from people that I had gone to church with previously. People, and very loving, very caring people, were concerned because of what they had heard and read about the Unity movement. And with that, I took the disapproval of people, and that's putting it mildly in some cases. But sometimes we really have to do that in order to be authentic and honest with our own selves. We have to move forward with the guidance and the light that we see and not do what the masses are doing. I really love what my daughter said when I really kept it under wraps that I was moving toward, that I was completing all the prerequisites to get into seminary. I only let people know that on a need-to-know basis. I didn't really tell anyone, and including my children and my family. So when I told my daughter, I told each of my children at different times. And if you have adult children, you know how hard it is to get all of your adult children together again. So I was telling my daughter, what I had done and that I'd been accepted and all of this. And she said, yeah, there was a point at which I thought that, I read some things and I thought maybe you were involving yourself in something that maybe you ought not to or whatever. And she said, by now, Mom, I know you. And if there was anything wrong with it, you would have found out by now. So, that really sticks with me because she believed in me. Sometimes maybe you'll have 1, 2, 3 handful of people that will if not see things your way, at least be open to allow you to go your own way and not ostracize you. Sometimes we just have to let go of the need to be accepted in certain situations. Years ago, I heard Cheryl Richardson say this. She's an author and speaker. It was at the Unity Church in Houston. I don't remember a single other thing she said. It was about 30 years ago, except this. She said, sometimes it's better to give up good for great. Sometimes a situation or a relationship may be good, but releasing it, we go to great, to doing exactly what is ours to do in the world. Stop arguing for our limitations. Another story. I had this client years ago, and she came to me for years. This was when women got shampoos and sets every single week. They had standing appointments, and they came at the same time, same day, and all of this. And she really was one of the most negative people that I've ever encountered in my life. Just everything that she talked about, almost everything, had negative connotations to it. And I didn't want to ostracize her, but I would say things to her like, well, why don't you try this? Well, have you thought about that? Well, no, that won't work. I tried that before. It won't work because of this reason and this reason and this reason. Arguing constantly for her limitations. Arguing so that she could stay in that comfortable place, even though she fussed and complained. It was what she knew. That's what made it comfortable. It was her comfort zone. It was the life that she knew. Well, one day I said to her, she had been coming to me I did hair in the same area for like 30 years, so I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 years. And one day, I don't know why I said this, but I said, okay, I called her name and I said, we have a new rule here. For every negative thing that you say, you have to say something positive. And she went, and was silent for a little while, and then she said, well, then I guess I just won't talk. She really was basically a wonderful, really good person, a really good-hearted person. And I think maybe she really didn't know what she was doing with the speech that she was using. Sometimes we have blind spots that we need, like Mary was talking about. We need a counselor or a therapist to help us see our way out of those blind spots. Sometimes our friends or family will help us with those blind spots. Do your best to be open. Do your best to understand maybe where that person is coming from. And try not to argue for your limitations. Not going along with the collective consciousness. Here's a story that I like, and when I first heard it, I used to just really hang on to it. It was many years ago. That J.D. Rockefeller used his money, part of what he used his money for was hospitals, museums, parks, libraries, universities. He apparently, from what I understand, gave generously to these things. And the Depression hit, and he continued to give money away. And one time in a newspaper columnist was asking him questions, and one of the things he said to him was, you continue to give your money to these charities and all of this. He said, we're in a depression. Why do you still give your money away? And Mr. Rockefeller said, yes, I heard about the depression, but I decided not to participate. You know, it's simple, but maybe not easy. It's just simple not to buy into a certain mindset simply because the masses are doing it. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of quotations. As I talked to you earlier about the opposite of what I said earlier, this is a quotation about holding open the gates of your mind. Not to say that you're going to bring in and believe everything that you hear, but it's at least openness to bring in and size up the things that you hear. And say to yourself, does this work for me or does it not? If it works for me, embrace it. If it doesn't work for me, with the breath of kindness, you just blow it away. Dale Carnegie, keep your mind open to change all of the time. Welcome it. Court it. It is only by examining and re-examining your opinions and ideas that you ever make progress. Open your mind to a new way of thinking. Challenge the things around you, even things that you take for granted every single day. Roll it over in your mind and make a decision. Do I believe that today, or is that for yesterday? And the last quotation is by Oliver Wendell Holmes. A mind once stretched by a new idea can never go back to its original dimension. You cannot unknow what you know. When you hold your mind open to new ways of thinking, new ideas, new thoughts, progress takes place. Thank you.